It's a picture here of the wayward child of God coming back into what is going to be one of the most important themes of Ruth, which is the significance of the community of faith. We are all familiar with the phrase, and that phrase, as soon as I say it, you'll know exactly where it comes from the passage. It's the phrase bittersweet. We know what bittersweet means. It's just this mixture of sweetness and sourness, this mixture of something pleasant along with something sad. And if there ever was a bittersweet moment, it is, of course, the moment in which sweet returns to the land of bread and no longer wants to even be known as sweet, but now she wants to be known as bitter. She is indeed the personification of bittersweet. And so it's to her return that we begin to look this morning. We will begin our passage in the section that ends with the last verse right before what's probably a subheading in your Bible that occurs before verse 19. But let's begin from verse 18. So we read from verse 18, "And when Naomi saw that she," meaning Ruth, who had just completed this most beautiful of departure speeches, saying, "I depart from my land, from my gods. Your God is my God. Your people are my people. I will go to the grave and rest beside you in the grave." She just finishes that, and then we read that when Naomi saw or perceived or understood that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. I take that to mean that the rest of the journey back to Bethlehem was done in more or less silence, as though both women just no longer had anything to say after all that had occurred. So they make this trip back to Bethlehem. The journey would have been a long one, an arduous one. And as they make this trip back to Bethlehem, I picture in my mind just a journey of two women that's made in silence, in which they just don't know what else to say. And they are perhaps just occupied with their own thoughts. Their own thoughts are racing through their minds, and they're so filled with all the events and how everything has come to this point that is what dominates the journey back. I picture as they're journeying that Naomi is probably elderly enough that she needs Ruth to help her along, perhaps in some parts of the journey, maybe stepping over some creek beds or over some rocks or whatnot. She probably needs some help because she just said earlier that she's too old to remarry. We'll know later on in the story in chapter 2 that she does not go to the fields to glean the barley, so that leads us to believe that she's too old to harvest in the field. So perhaps Ruth is having to help her along, but she's doing so in silence. And just think for just a moment of what's going through the minds of these two ladies. These two ladies have now lost everything. Ruth, let's think of what's probably going through her mind as she's journeying. She's thinking of what is this life that she's going to? Who are these people that she's going to find there? Will they receive her? Will they accept her? Will they scorn her? Will they hate her? Will they abuse her? Will they assault her? What will they say? As soon as they see her, they will know that she's a Moabite, from her appearance and from her dress. And she is leaving the land from which she knew everything. Her whole life is now being left behind her. She is indeed, as she said earlier, leaving everything to accompany Naomi. The land from which she grew up in, all of her childhood memories, all of her friends, her family. She left her family to marry into the Israelite family years ago. Yet now she leaves them for good. She will never see them again. And she's lost her husband, and she's lost her brother-in-law, and she's lost her father-in-law, but she's also now lost something else. She's lost now a sister-in-law, as has Naomi. So she has now indeed lost everything, seemingly, that she could possibly lose. And as she travels along on this arduous trip, she has to be thinking, what does life have in store for her in this new home in Israel, in Bethlehem? Not to mention the fact that she is now just beginning upon this new life of conversion. Because on the trip is when she professed this new birth, when she professed this faith and this devotion to Yahweh, the living God. So now she begins this new life on the trip to Bethlehem. What a way to begin a new life of walking with the living God, with the Almighty God, to begin that life in such a position of not knowing what lies ahead, what lies in the future. Will they be able to eat? They have no house to go to. They have no possessions. They have no resources. They have no money. Will they be able to eat? Where will they sleep? What will the people do? How will they treat them? So many unknowns are going through Ruth's mind. And then think for just a moment of what's going through Naomi's mind as she makes this trip back to Bethlehem. She too has lost her husband. She has lost both of her sons. And she too has now incurred a new loss of a daughter-in-law that she will never see again. She's leaving behind a decade or more of pain and toil and trouble, possibly humiliation and embarrassment, but nonetheless, it's still a decade of her life. Even leaving behind bad experiences can be sad and problematic. And so she leaves all of that behind on her way back now to Bethlehem. What will the people do when they see her? How will they receive her? Because what do people do in a famine? Particularly, what do God's people do in a famine? They help one another. And what did Naomi do? She left. She left the famine to them. She left to look out for number one. She left to make sure that they went to where food was, leaving behind family, friends, the village from which she grew up in. Not only did she grow up in that village, but we learned last week that Elimelech and his family goes way, way back, even to before the time that it was known as Bethlehem. And so she's returning to this small village where memories are long. And as she returns, she's got to be thinking, what will the people think of me? Will they be angry? Will they still hold a grudge to me for leaving them and going to the land of these pagan gods? Or will all that be forgotten? Or will the people that I knew in Bethlehem even still be there? Because she did leave in a famine. Maybe they've died. Maybe she'll get back to Bethlehem and no one will know her, and she will know no one. And she will have no place to stay, no shelter to find, no food to find. All these questions must be hanging heavily in Naomi's mind, plus the burden of Ruth. Because we all can relate to how it feels to sense that burden of someone who's depending upon you. Yes, Naomi is elderly, and yes, she probably can't glean in the fields and work now, but nonetheless, here is Ruth, who in a real sense is going to depend and rely upon her. Most of us can relate to the fact that when there comes the stresses of just providing and making a living and making the ends meet, that all those stresses are exponentially multiplied with the number of mouths that you have to feed. And so now the burden is added onto Naomi that here is Ruth. And yes, she's younger and stronger than me, but nevertheless, this is my home. And it's going to be kind of up to me to find a way to make ends meet. So they make this journey saying no more. Verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. So they create quite a stir as they enter into this small village of Bethlehem. If you've read anything about Bethlehem, or perhaps if you know someone who's gone there or gone there yourself, then what I am told about Bethlehem, that even though it is one of the most significant places in all of redemption history, of course, our Savior was born there. Of course, Rachel is buried there. David is from Bethlehem. David was anointed king there. All those things took place, giving it enormous spiritual significance in redemption history. Nevertheless, being so important in redemption history, it is still to this day a tiny little place. I'm told that those who visit Bethlehem go there and see everything there is to see rather quickly, and then that's all there is to see. Because just like in the time of Jesus, just like in the time of Ruth and Naomi, Bethlehem was this tiny little village. And we know how villages work. Everybody knows everybody's business. Everybody knows who's there and who's not there, and everybody knows what everybody's been up to, and all the skeletons in people's closets. And so here comes Naomi back, and we find that not only is she remembered, but she causes this stir among them, and they see Naomi coming. You can imagine the questions. Is this Naomi, we read? Is this really her? That looks like Naomi. But you know, she's changed. She's changed because suffering can change a person. The lines on her face are probably deeper. Probably more of those lines, particularly the worry lines. The lines on the brow, the lines in the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth are deeper. The mouth is sagging down now. The wrinkles are more prominent. The hair, when Naomi left, perhaps was this dark jet black. Now perhaps it's solid white, and she's a bit stooped over, and she's a lot thinner. And she has this air about her, this air of heaviness and this air of sadness. Is this Naomi, the Naomi that we knew a decade ago? The one who was happy and always willing to joke around with? Is this really her? Is this Naomi? Is the buzz that's going around? You can just hear the stir that's going around. Verse 20, and she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. So that's now the third time that we have read that word bitterly. We read it twice here in verse 20. You can see it one time there. The other time you see it doesn't look like bitter, because it is left as Mara. It's translated as a proper name, but that's just the Hebrew word for bitter. She says, call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. We read it again back in verse 13, when Naomi says to the two ladies, return, go back, for the Lord has treated me with exceeding bitterness. He has been exceedingly bitter to me for your sake. So return, so go back. So now that's the third time that we have read of this bitterness. And she comes back saying with this little speech here, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty, the Shaddai, has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So there's a number of things for us to begin seeing here. In order to see them, let me just now begin showing to all of us the author's, one of his favorite literary techniques. We talked last time just about the literary beauty and value of the story of Ruth. It is widely renowned as not just a precious Bible story, but also a story of particular literary skill. And one of the techniques or the tactics that the author is going to use is something that we've seen before elsewhere. In fact, as we pause in our study of Mark, it's something that we see often in Mark, and that is Mark's tendency to, we call bracket or sandwich or put these episodes together. And what he does, he takes this with stories, with episodes. And he'll take two episodes and sandwich them together. He'll begin telling of one episode, interrupt himself to tell of the other one, and then come back to finish telling of the first. And as we've seen that this is his literary technique, we see what it is doing for the reader, because it takes the reader's focus and it takes the reader's attention and it just draws it in like a funnel. Well, the author of Ruth is going to do something very similar, only not with episodes and stories. He or she will do it with phrases. And so let me begin showing us how the author will use these phrases to use them as maybe frames or brackets or parentheses around sections of the passage in order to draw our focus and draw our attention into what he or she wants for us to see. Now, don't worry if you say, I have never seen that. Don't worry, because you don't have to see it. You don't have to recognize this in order for it to do what the author intends for it to do. As you read, the reader naturally is drawn where he wants your thoughts to go, even if you don't see what he's doing. But I'm just going to point this out so that we can follow his train of thought. So he's going to do this in our passage 3 times today. And the first time we see this, these two brackets, the first one occurs in verse 8 and verse 19. So verse 19, the first one is going to occur, we're going to look back at the first one in verse 1. Look up in the beginning of chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now look down to the end of the chapter, and we'll see the other half of the bracket. Chapter 1 and verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So you see the two brackets there, the two parentheses, so to speak, the two frames. Verse 1, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to Moab. Verse 22, they returned from Moab and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of a feast. You see it? You have Moab, Bethlehem, and then famine feast. And so what the author is doing is like he's taking these two brackets. He's using his words, his phrases to say, zero in, think about this as one thought. This is one thought that I want to express to you. Think of chapter 1 as this one expression of thought, which includes setting the tragedy, setting the trip to Moab, setting up the deaths and all that, and then the decision to return, the proclamation by Naomi, I've got no resources for you, the dedication, the devotion of Ruth, and then the journey back. All that is bracketed together, and we see that because it begins by saying there was a man of Bethlehem who went to Moab because there's no food. And it ends by saying they came to Bethlehem from Moab because there was food. So we're to see that and think, and again, to recognize that it is unimportant completely, but just to see that this is how the author is directing our thoughts into that. So we now see that this is sort of the larger context that he's setting, the larger context of this is what's happened in Naomi's life to bring her to this point. This is the past. This is the baggage that she has with us, and this is what has occurred between her and Orpah and her and Ruth in order to set up this entrance into Bethlehem. Because when they enter into Bethlehem is when the story in earnest really begins. So that's the first thing that we see there. But now let's focus our thoughts in. Let's sort of zero in at the second set of brackets. All right, so we see that begin in verse 19. So now you'll probably see this right away. So verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, then you look down to chapter 1 and verse 22, and we'll see the other half of the bracket. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem. It's unmistakable, isn't it? The same phrase 3 times, they came to Bethlehem. And so those phrases, they came to Bethlehem, think of it in your mind as the author is doing this. And he's saying this right here. Let me just draw you in. Let me just draw your focus right here. I want you to see that between these two brackets, here's what I want to show you. What I want to show you is Naomi's heart. What I want to show you is the place where she is at spiritually. We saw a little bit of her heart before. We saw a little glimpse into her heart before, as we saw that she has this love and concern for Ruth and for Orpah, and she tells them to go back, but she's foolish, and how she tells them just return to your gods. And we see something about just her sadness and her brokenness of heart, but we really haven't yet seen where she is at spiritually yet. Now the author is saying, let me show you exactly where she's at, and he brackets this in and sort of brings our focus in. So as they return, the larger set of brackets has them returning. And as they return, we're told that they return from the country of Moab back to Bethlehem for the barley harvest. So let's think for just a minute before we zone in on Naomi's heart right now. Let's think for just a minute at how the whole story is set up for us to see as they leave the house of bread because there is no bread. Now they come back to the house of bread because not only is there bread, but we're going to see that there is bountiful bread. There is abundant bread. We're going to see that as the story plays itself out, particularly in chapter 2, that the barley harvest this year is particularly abundant because Ruth is going to gather an excessive amount of barley from the leftover gleanings. We'll see that next week in chapter 2. But as they return here for the barley harvest, let's just think for just a moment about what the barley harvest means. The barley harvest was the first harvest of the year, and the barley harvest took place rather early in the year. It took place around late April, early May timeframe. And so if you know anything about harvesting, you know that a harvest that occurs in April, May is a very early harvest. It takes place a few weeks before the wheat harvest. Now, the barley harvest, being the first harvest of the year, is always viewed by the Israelites as something of an indication of what the rest of the harvests will be. If the barley harvest is poor, then that's a pretty good indication that all of the harvest that year will also be poor. If the barley harvest is good, that's another indication that the rest of the harvest can be expected to be good as well. So the barley harvest, being the first harvest of the year, also coincides with something else. It coincides with a feast called the Feast of Harvests, or the Festival of Harvest. Anybody know the other name for that? Pentecost. Pentecost coincides, it is the same thing as the Feast of Harvest or the Festival of Harvests. Pentecost occurs 50 days after Passover. And so the Feast of Harvest is intended by God to be this celebration in which one of the three celebrations of the year in which Israelites were supposed to come to Jerusalem. And as they come to Jerusalem, there's this big festival that celebrates what? The first harvest of the year. Because the first harvest is what is telling them, will we have a good year this year? And if the harvest is bountiful, then that gives them abundant opportunity to thank God and praise God for the ingathering of the abundant harvest of barley. Now, Pentecost also has a connection for us that we all know very well that takes place in the New Testament. Acts chapter 2 and verse 1. What occurs at Pentecost is the tongues of fire, the giving of the Spirit, and that takes place specifically in the context in which Jerusalem is filled with what? Foreigners, because they all come to Jerusalem for the festival, for the Feast of Harvests. And that's why the tongues are so important, because in all their languages, the gospel is spoken and it's heard, and it is the ingathering of the harvest. It's the ingathering of the Gentiles. It's the ingathering of the church. That all coincides with the Festival of Harvest, which is the ingathering of the crops. And so you see the connection. You see why Jesus will use the analogy so often of things such as the harvest is plentiful. Pray to the Lord of harvest that He would send laborers because the harvest is plentiful. And so you see His train of thought there. You see His connection. Just as the Festival of the Harvest is celebrating the ingathering of grain, so also the Pentecost celebrates the ingathering of Gentiles. But now we have a Gentile coming to the land of promise. You see, this is truly the beginning of what Pentecost means. It is the ingathering of the Gentiles who are be grafted into the family of God. And here comes Ruth. And here comes Naomi. And they are coming in right here at Pentecost, at the barley harvest. Now, another thing that we recognize about the harvest time, and this is probably something that's rather difficult for most of us to relate to, because none of us have ever lived in a truly agrarian society. Generations ago, we were more agrarian than we are now as a whole. And there are still many of us that have lots of ties to agrarian lifestyles and that sort of thing. But that's not to say that we are truly an agrarian culture. We aren't, and we haven't been for many, many generations. But those who live in a truly agrarian culture will tell you one thing, and that is that the absolute most joyful time of the year is harvest. Because harvest literally means the difference between will we eat or will we be hungry for another year. And so the harvest time, particularly if it's a good harvest, is the most abundantly joyful time of an agrarian community of the whole year. That's why the Festival of Harvest was such a joyful festival. So here comes Naomi and here comes Ruth. The picture of sadness, particularly Naomi, the picture of brokenness, the picture of sadness, the picture of distress. And here she comes into the picture of joyfulness. It's a picture here of the wayward child of God coming back into what is going to be one of the most important themes of Ruth, which is the significance of the community of faith. She comes back into the community of faith, and she, in her brokenness and in her sadness, is coming back to be joined back together with a joyful band of people at harvest time.